If you boil wealth all the way down, strip away the fashion, the jargon, the envy, the social media theater, the motivational noise, and the ego, there are really only three enduring ways a person becomes rich. He builds something, he buys something, or he enters a system where value is already being created, takes his share of the cash flowing through it, and steadily converts that cash into ownership. That is it. There are endless variations around those three paths. There are different industries, different personalities, different decades, different economic climates, and different starting points. But the underlying mechanics do not change. Wealth flows to ownership. It always has. And if you spend enough years around money, balance sheets, businesses, and human behavior, you eventually notice that most people do not fail because the rules were hidden from them. They fail because the rules were too simple to satisfy the kind of story they wanted to believe. People want wealth to come from a secret, a hidden strategy, a trick, a new corner of the internet, a token, a market cycle, a guru, a moment of genius, something exciting enough that it flatters the person hearing it. The truth is less flattering and far more useful. If you want enough money to feel wealthy in any meaningful, durable sense, you need either to own a machine that creates value, buy pieces of machines that already create value, or place yourself inside a machine so close to the profit stream that your labor can be converted into ownership before lifestyle and vanity consume it. That is the whole map. Now, because I have lived through enough market cycles and enough human delusion, let me add the next truth. These three paths are easy to understand and difficult to execute. That is why people keep looking for a fourth path. They do not want a different answer. They want an easier one. There usually is not one. The first path is the oldest and the most romanticized. You build it, you create the machine, you start with almost nothing except an observation, an irritation, a gap in the market, a demand. Nobody is serving well, a process everybody hates, a product that is worse than it should be, or a system so inefficient that it almost feels insulting. Then you solve it, then you standardize the solution, then you find a way to distribute it at scale. Then, if you are one of the rare people who can actually do all of that while retaining enough ownership, wealth appears. Not because the world rewarded your hard work in some moral sense. The world does not pay on morality, it pays on leverage. And building is one of the few places where leverage can become extreme. A person who earns $300,000 a year through salary can live very well. He may become comfortable, he may even become affluent by ordinary standards. But his income is still linear. It is tied to labor, to time, to negotiated compensation, to hours, to title, to whether the system still wants him where he is. Even a big salary has a leash. Ownership of a scalable machine does not behave that way. If you own 60% of a business that goes from 1 million in revenue to 10 million, and then to 50 million, and then to 100 million, your wealth is not increasing because you worked 100 times harder. It is increasing because the market begins valuing control over a larger stream of future cash flows. That is why founders can look absurdly rich to outsiders. The outsider thinks in wages. The founder is being repriced in equity. Those are different universes. This is where a great many people go wrong. They think building is mainly about passion. I have nothing against passion. But passion is not the engine. Structural leverage is the engine. You do not become rich because you loved coffee and opened a cafe. You become rich because you created a repeatable system with healthy margins, strong distribution, and enough scale that your personal labor stops being the limiting factor. If it cannot scale, it probably cannot make you truly wealthy. If it cannot detach from your personal effort, it is a job with branding. If you do not retain enough equity, the scale may enrich everyone around you more than it enriches you. That is the brutal part people do not enjoy hearing. A person can build something impressive and still not become rich because he built the wrong kind of thing, or because he kept too little of it, or because he never solved distribution, or because the market itself was too small, or because the margins were too weak. The market does not pay for effort, it pays for scalable economic value. That is the rule. I have always liked simple step sequences because life gets blurry when it becomes emotional. So if I were explaining the first path to a young person who wanted the cold version and not the inspirational version, I would say it this way. First, identify a real inefficiency or unmet demand. Second, create a repeatable solution that works even when you are tired, not inspired, not in the mood, and not improvising. Third, standardize delivery, because what cannot be repeated cannot be scaled. Fourth, build distribution. Because a mediocre product with superior distribution often defeats a superior product no one can find. Fifth, retain enough ownership so that when the machine finally works, the economics matter to you. Most people fail on the fifth step, some fail earlier, but the fifth is where many self-employed people get trapped. They build a business that depends completely on them, give away too much ownership, or never build the systems that would let the business keep running without their body in the center of every process. That is not wealth, that is labor wearing a nicer suit. Now let me tell you something else that matters here. Timing is real, not in the sense that people on television use the word I do not mean predicting quarterly cycles or the next central bank pivot. I mean market selection. If you build in a shrinking market, you are fighting gravity. If you build in an expanding market, the wind helps you. This is one reason why certain decades mint a great many fortunes around a certain category. The internet in the early 2000s, mobile ecosystems in the 2010s, cloud infrastructure, software subscription models, semiconductor demand, artificial intelligence tooling. The founders involved are not always the only smart people in the world. They often happen to be riding an expanding system where even imperfect execution can look extraordinary. Because the market itself is widening underneath them, that is another truth people do not love. Because it contaminates the merit story. Fine reality is under no obligation to preserve anybody as preferred story. Building is powerful. It is also emotionally expensive. There is no salary cushion in the early years, unless you create one. Identity is unstable. Progress is often invisible for long stretches. Feedback is violent. You are wrong in public. You have to learn while being judged. That is why not everyone is built for it. The upside is asymmetric. The losses are mostly time stress, reputation bruises, and some capital. The upside can be generational. That asymmetry is what attracts extreme people. And because outcomes follow a power law rather than a normal curve, a few great builders can make the whole path look more common than it really is. It is not common. It is simply one of the three true paths. The second path is less romantic and, for many people, far more realistic. You buy the machine instead of building it. This is the ownership path most people talk about and very few people understand deeply enough. Here you are not inventing the business. You are not designing the engine. You are not hiring the first team or negotiating the first customer contract. You are taking capital and buying productive assets that already work. Then you let time, reinvestment, and compounding do the scaling for you. This path has made more people meaningfully wealthy than the culture likes to admit because it is too boring to sell dramatically. It lacks startup mythology, it lacks the founder's aura, it lacks the adrenaline of creation. What it has is math. That is enough. Historically, broad equity ownership has compounded extremely well over long periods. Real estate held intelligently has combined yield with appreciation. Private businesses purchased at sensible prices have generated cash flow regardless of whether the owner personally showed up to unlock the door. Private equity, venture capital, public stocks, index funds, well-bought rental property, ownership stakes in operating businesses, all of these can work because they share one feature. They are productive. That word matters. A productive asset either generates cash flow, grows in value because underlying earnings grow, or preferably does both. This is where many people get lost. They buy things that only rise if someone else later pays more for them and call themselves investors. That is not the same thing. If the thing itself does not produce value, then much of what you are relying on is a greater fool chain. Those chains can go on for a while. They are not compounding in the sense I admire. Compounding requires an engine. You need cash generation, economic relevance, retained earnings deployed intelligently, reinvested distributions, or some combination of all four. Otherwise, you are mostly gambling on mood. Let us take the cleanest case. Suppose you invest $20,000 a year into a productive set of assets, and those assets compound around 8% over a long period. Early on, nothing about the experience feels rich. That is the great psychological challenge of the investor path. The early years are visually insulting. The account value moves. Yes, but not in a way that feels remotely proportional to the restraint required to fund it. That is why so many people quit before compounding ever becomes emotionally visible. They judge the machine in the assembly phase and conclude that the machine must be broken. It is not broken, it is small. That is different in investing. The shape of the curve matters more than the emotional texture of the first years. Returns begin slowly because the base is small. Then the base grows. Then the same percentage begins producing larger and larger absolute dollars. The acceleration arrives later. Most people understand this intellectually and still live as though they do not, because the emotional brain is offended by delayed proof. That is why the investor path rewards consistency more than brilliance. It rewards duration more than intensity. It rewards staying invested more than it rewards performing intelligence. The public hates that because it sounds too easy. It is easy to describe. It is difficult to endure. The actual step sequence for the investor path is almost embarrassingly plain. Accumulate surplus capital. Allocate that capital into productive assets. Reinvest the cash flow. Repeat. Avoid catastrophic loss. That is all. Nothing there sounds glamorous enough for a conference ticket. That is one reason it works so well. When I say avoid catastrophic loss, I mean something serious. The market can survive ordinary mistakes. Your portfolio can survive bad years. It can survive recessions, ugly headlines, even a few foolish choices. What it does not survive well are large permanent losses caused by leverage, concentration in weak assets, panic selling, or the kind of fragile structure that forces you to liquidate when prices are awful. This is one reason I have always disliked borrowed money in ordinary investing. Leverage lets you be right and still go broke because the timing stops belonging to you. If you own productive assets without leverage and with enough reserves, volatility is an unpleasant visitor. If you own them badly financed and emotionally underprepared, volatility becomes an executioner. The investor path is slower than building, especially at the beginning. It is also more democratic. Not everyone can found a great business. A person can still become rich enough to change his family forever through disciplined ownership that matters more than people think. The real edge in this path is not information. It is temperament. Can you keep buying when the market looks ugly? Can you reinvest when others want to consume? Can you tolerate boredom? Can you stop treating every price movement as a moral referendum on your intelligence? Can you remain an owner? That is the whole game. The third path is the bridge path. This one is more interesting than people realize because it is where a great many fortunes actually begin. You do not start with capital. You do not want to or cannot build from zero. So you enter an existing high-value system, position yourself close to leverage, get paid exceptionally well because the system itself is large, and then convert that income into ownership. This is not glamorous enough for some people because they think the only respectable paths are founder mythology or investing mythology. That is childish. A high earner with discipline can become rich, not because salary itself is magical. Salary by itself has a ceiling, yes, but salary inside the right machine, converted into ownership with seriousness and without lifestyle drift, can create a second machine. That is how the bridge path works. First, you acquire a scarce skill that matters economically. Not a hobby, not a fashionable self-description, a real skill. Something that either drives revenue, saves large costs, allocates capital, manages risk, sells complex things, builds essential systems, engineers productivity, or operates close to a large profit pool. The economy does not pay according to the poetry of what you love. It pays according to the scarcity and leverage of the value you create. That is one reason people get confused about careers. They think passion is the main issue. Passion helps. It is not the main issue. Scarcity is the main issue. Leverage is the main issue. Economic relevance is the main issue. A brilliant engineer in a low-value, stagnant firm may be underpaid relative to his ability. A good enough engineer inside a giant platform serving millions of users may be paid far more because the surrounding system multiplies his output. This is why system selection matters. That is the second phase. You choose the right machine technology platforms. Finance, enterprise sales, energy, capital, intensive global industries, executive tracks inside large enterprises, law tied to large transactions, fields where value creation is measured in very large numbers, a strong skill inside a weak system still caps income. A merely good skill inside a powerful system can produce extraordinary pay because the system's scale does the amplifying. The third phase is proximity to capital. This is where many ambitious people stall. They work hard, they become capable, they become respected, and they remain too far from the upside. They become operators without equity, specialists without profit share, contributors without ownership, highly paid labor. But labor nonetheless. If you want the bridge path to work, you eventually have to negotiate closer to the real money. Equity grants, carried interest, profit participation, performance compensation tied to enterprise value, restricted stock, business, unit economics. Some route that gets you from income into ownership with more force than a salary check alone. Otherwise, you can live very well and still remain more dependent than you should be. The fourth phase is the conversion itself. This is where most high earners fail. Not because they are underpaid, because they inflate. A person moves into a high income role and immediately begins upgrading life to match the income. Better neighborhood, bigger house, nicer car, more expensive schools, better vacations, restaurants as identity. Every bonus pre-spent in the imagination before it even hits the account. That is how people remain rich, looking, and fail to become rich. The bridge path only works if large income is converted into productive ownership aggressively and early. Every bonus should have a destination. Every equity vest should be part of a system. Every large check should become capital before the ego gets to interview it. If someone earns $400,000 and lives on $120, the difference has power. If the same person earns $400,000 and spends $380, the system is impressive, and the personal balance sheet is weak. That is the great deception of the upper middle class. They look successful and remain financially fragile because the machine they entered pays them well, but they never built a second machine on top of it. The fifth phase is detachment eventually. If the conversion has been done well enough or long enough, labor becomes optional rather than mandatory. That does not mean a person stops working. It means work stops being the only thing standing between the family and collapse. That is what actual wealth feels like. Not luxury first, optionality first. This is where the bridge path merges into the investor path. The salary was the bridge. Ownership is the destination. Now, if you step back and compare these three paths honestly, they each carry a different pain profile. Building something is the highest volatility path emotionally and often economically. It can create enormous wealth because ownership of a scalable asset can reprice nonlinearly. It can also fail completely because most new businesses do fail. Buying productive assets is slower, steadier, and more democratic. It rarely creates overnight mythology. It very often creates durable wealth if the investor keeps costs low, owns quality, remains patient, and survives his own emotions. Entering a system and converting income into ownership is the bridge path. It can be extraordinarily powerful for people who do not have capital yet, but are willing to become highly valuable inside a machine large enough to pay them well. Its main enemy is not lack of opportunity. It is lifestyle inflation. This is an important thing to understand. People do not fail the bridge path because they were never paid enough. Many fail because they did not convert. And all three paths, in the end, collapse into the same final truth. Wealth belongs to owners. That is the sentence I want burned into your mind. Wealth belongs to owners, not workers only, not consumers, not borrowers, living for the weekend, not spectators with opinions. Owners, if you do not own productive assets, then much of your effort is always enriching someone who does. That is what the whole system is built to do. Now let me say something that will make certain people uncomfortable. A lot of the modern conversation about money is trapped in the wrong frame because it overemphasizes income and underemphasizes ownership. Parents tell children to get a good job, schools tell students to get credentials, entire cultures tell people to pursue security. Fine, security is not worthless, but a good job by itself does not solve the wealth problem unless the job either leads to ownership directly or produces enough surplus that ownership is built on top of it. Otherwise, you simply become a high-functioning employee in someone else's compounding machine. The employer compounds, the shareholder compounds, the founder compounds, you consume the check and call yourself responsible. That is not a winning design. I am not insulting honest labor. I admire honest labor. I am insulting the idea that labor alone without ownership is enough to produce substantial long-term wealth for most people. It is often not. That is why I have always preferred thinking in systems. Where is the leverage? Where is the scalability? Where does the ownership sit? Who gets paid first? Who gets paid when nothing dramatic happens? Who gets paid when the market expands? Who gets paid when the company grows? Who gets paid when time passes and retained earnings compound? Those are the right questions. The crowd does not ask them because the crowd is hypnotized by visible rewards, salary, title, office size, a bigger house, a nicer car. What the crowd often misses is the distinction between being paid well and becoming wealthy. One is current, the other is structural, one improves the month, the other improves the decades. They are not the same thing. I think this is why so many intelligent people end up confused in middle age. They did everything that sounded right. They got the degrees, they took the jobs, they earned the raises, they became respectable. Yet somehow they still feel dependent. That feeling is not imaginary. It is the sensation of having income without enough ownership. That is why the three paths matter so much. They are not merely business categories. They are routes toward escaping dependence. The founder path says, create the engine and retain enough equity that scale belongs to you. The investor path says, buy pieces of productive engines and let compounding do the hard work over time. The bridge path says, enter a large existing engine, get paid exceptionally well inside it, and convert labor into ownership before the ego gets to spend it. Everything else is mostly decoration. Now, because I know how people think, let me address the emotional excuses that keep them from acting. The first excuse is that the founder path feels too risky. It is risky. That is why the upside exists. The second excuse is that the investor path feels too slow. It is slow. That is why ordinary people can still use it. The third excuse is that the bridge path feels too hard because becoming highly valuable in a leverage, rich system requires skill, discipline, and often years of relative obscurity before the payoff becomes visible. Correct again. And what do these three correct objections have in common? They all reveal the same thing. Wealth is simple and difficult, not mysterious and difficult, simple and difficult. There is a tremendous difference. A mysterious thing makes you search for hidden information. A simple, difficult thing makes you search for courage, consistency, and restraint. That is a harder search because it leads inward. People would rather research a market than examine their own impatience. They would rather debate macroeconomics than admit they cannot delay gratification. They would rather watch a video on the next 10 stocks to explode than face the fact that their spending system guarantees they will never have enough surplus to own anything serious. The truth has no obligation to be entertaining. It only has to work. If you are trying to decide what to do with your life financially, I would ask you three questions. First, do you have the temperament and opportunity to build something scalable and retain ownership? Second, if not, are you steadily buying productive assets with enough seriousness that time can do something meaningful for you? Third, if you still lack capital, have you placed yourself inside a system where your income can become large enough to convert into ownership? Or are you just hoping that ordinary wage labor alone will somehow solve a structural ownership problem? Those are the questions that matter. I do not care much what style you choose. Some people are builders, some are superb capital allocators, some are elite operators inside large systems who wisely convert compensation into equity and eventually step into freedom through accumulation. Fine. You do not need all three. You need one done seriously, and seriousness is the rare thing. Most people flirt with these paths. They say they want to start a business and spend 5 years researching logos instead of distribution. They say they want to invest and spend 10 years timing markets instead of buying productive assets regularly. They say they want high income and then consume every dollar that should have become future ownership. That is not path selection. That is entertainment. I have nothing against entertainment. I just do not confuse it with wealth creation. Let me tell you the single most important sentence in this whole discussion. If you do not own, you stay dependent longer than necessary. That dependency may be elegant. It may wear good fabric and smell like an airport lounge. It may sound sophisticated and arrive with annual bonuses. It is still dependency. And wealth, real wealth, is the gradual purchase of independence. Not total independence, that is fantasy, but increasing independence. More choices, more time, more bargaining power, more ability to say no, more ability to wait, more ability to withstand nonsense from employers, markets, and life in general without immediately bending the knee. That is what ownership buys. That is why I have always loved it. Whether through Berkshire stock, whole businesses, or the right cash, generative enterprises held patiently, I was always at bottom buying more independence. That is the true utility of wealth. Not yachts, not bragging rights, not appearing successful to strangers. Independence. So if you are still young enough to choose a path that leads to ownership. If you are already deep into work, convert income into ownership before another decade disappears. If you have capital, buy productive assets and stop asking them to entertain you. And if you are among the rare people meant to build, then build something that can scale, solve distribution, control margins, and keep enough equity that success still matters when it arrives. The world will keep inventing distractions. It will keep inventing little stories that sound like shortcuts. Ignore most of them, build, buy, or enter and convert. Those are still the only real ways. And because they are still the only real ways, they are likely to remain the best ones long after the fashionable language around money changes again. Now, I want to go a level deeper because people hear these three paths and immediately try to wriggle away from them. They start saying things like, yes, but I am not a founder, or yes, but I do not have enough money to invest meaningfully, or yes, but high-paying systems are hard to enter. Of course they are. Everything with leverage is hard in some way. That is why it pays. The world does not hand out extraordinary outcomes for ordinary emotional effort. And here is something else people need to understand. The reason these three paths continue to dominate is that they align with reality itself. Reality rewards control over cash flow. Reality rewards ownership of productive systems. Reality rewards being close to growth, close to margin, close to scale, and close to the decision rights that determine where the economic surplus goes. Most people are too far downstream. They are paid after too many others have already taken their cut. The founder tries to stand at the source. The investor buys claims on the source. The bridge path operator walks upstream until he can start diverting part of the flow into assets he owns. That is the difference. This is why I have never liked the phrase earn more as a complete answer. Earn more is fine as far as it goes. But earning more without ownership is like carrying more water in your hands instead of finally building a pipe. Your arms get tired, your hands still leak, your life improves for a while, and then the same dependence returns wearing nicer shoes. The founder path solves that by building the pipe. The investor path solves it by buying existing pipes. The bridge path solves it by using a salary to purchase pipes until labor is no longer the entire story. That is the only language that matters to me, not how can I feel rich next year. How can I reduce the fraction of my life that depends on my next paycheck? A person with $1 million in productive assets and a modest lifestyle is, in many practical ways, richer than a person earning $500,000 a year while owning almost nothing. The second man may dine better in public. The first man sleeps better in private, and private sleep is what I care about. People misunderstand me when they hear this because they think I am attacking ambition. I am attacking dependency disguised as ambition. There are many very ambitious people who are building no capital base at all. They are simply climbing inside somebody else's machine, earning more tokens, and spending them as fast as identity requires. Then one layoff, one corporate reorganization, one health issue, one market shift, one recession, and the whole performance of security is exposed. The reason that bothers me is not moral. It is inefficient. It is inefficient for a capable person to spend 30 years generating value and end the period with too little durable ownership. That is like working all your life for the right to remain anxious in a nicer neighborhood. No sensible person should want that. Let me explain why the bridge path is so underappreciated. The culture loves founders because founders make better stories. They can be placed on magazine covers. Their origin myths are cinematic. The culture also loves investors when they appear dramatic enough, which is why people want bold predictions and giant concentrated bets and declarations about the future of technology and civilization. Fine. But the bridge path is quieter. It looks like a person becoming excellent at something commercially important, placing that excellence inside a large and growing system, getting paid far above average, and refusing to let the income leak into vanity. That may not be glamorous. It can be incredibly powerful. If a person in finance, enterprise software, high-end sales, law, engineering, medicine, energy, or another leverage. Richfield spends 15 years converting large annual surpluses into productive assets. Instead of turning them into social proof, he can create more durable freedom than many small business owners who work twice as hard for half the leverage. That is a fact the culture does not like very much because it prefers visible struggle to invisible discipline. Visible struggle feels noble. Invisible discipline feels boring. Boring wins far more often than the public is willing to admit. It wins in investing, it wins in business, it wins in marriage, it wins in fitness, it wins in reputation, and boring. In this case, means doing the obvious intelligent thing repeatedly without needing the world to clap. That is why I think one of the most important questions in life is this: where is the compounding here? Not where is the excitement, not where is the applause. Where is the compounding? The founder asks that question about equity. The investor asks it about capital allocation, the bridge. Path earner asks it about income conversion. Each is looking for the same thing, a repeated action that gets easier and more powerful as time passes. That is what wealth is, compounding in money form. And because this is true, I think people should stop overcomplicating the first decision. You do not need to know the rest of your life this afternoon. You need to know which of the three paths you are primarily on right now. If you are trying to build something scalable, admit that clearly, then behave like a builder. Focus on distribution, margin systems, retention of equity, and the economics of scaling rather than the romance of being called a founder. If you are not building, then admit whether you are genuinely on the ownership path or merely talking about investing without doing enough of it to matter. Buying one stock now and then. Chasing stories and timing the market is not serious ownership behavior. It is emotional tourism. Serious ownership behavior is systematic. Surplus capital appears. It is allocated, the costs stay low. The time horizon stays long, the cash flow is reinvested. That is what serious ownership looks like. And if you are on the bridge path, then your life should be dominated by two priorities: increasing your economic value inside a large system, and converting the resulting income into assets before the ego hires a contractor. That is it. Now, here is another truth that people resist because it sounds unfair. The earlier you understand which path you are on, the more forgiving life becomes. A person who discovers ownership at 28 can make many mistakes and still do well. A person who does not take the subject seriously until 52 can still improve his life meaningfully. But the mathematics are less generous because the compounding window is shorter. That is why I am always urging people toward clarity. Clarity is not urgency for its own sake. It is respect for time. Time is the most important co-investor any of us will ever have. And it is the one investor you cannot replace once it leaves. This is also why I have so little patience for the phrase, "I am waiting until things settle down." Things do not settle down. Markets rotate. Governments misbehave. Industries change. Interest rates move. Life remains untidy. There will never be a year in which all the lights turn green at once and a pleasant voice says, "Now is the perfectly certain time to begin building ownership." That is not how the world works. The person who waits for all visible uncertainty to disappear usually pays for the comfort in the form of a worse price. Fewer years or a missed cycle. That is true in building businesses. It is true in buying assets. It is true in career moves. Uncertainty is not a defect in the process, it is the price of admission. That is why I would rather see a person choose a simple, clear path and begin imperfectly than spend 10 years talking himself into emotional readiness. Readiness is overrated. Structure matters more. Another thing people miss is that the three paths are not mutually exclusive forever. In fact, the best lives often combine them in sequence. A person begins on the bridge path, becomes very valuable inside a powerful system, saves aggressively, and buys assets consistently. Then perhaps he later builds something because his capital base and operating experience give him the courage and cushion to take the founder risk. Or a founder who has sold a company becomes an investor with more size and patience than he ever had before. Or an investor with a strong asset base becomes a silent owner in small private businesses and moves closer to the build path indirectly. That is perfectly sensible. The paths can blend, but people still need one primary engine at any given time. Drifting between them without commitment is where many lives lose force. I see this often. A person says he wants to start a company but still behaves like a hobbyist. He says he wants to invest but never produces enough surplus to matter. He says he wants high income but never makes the hard moves required to enter a large profit pool. He wants all three stories emotionally and none of the discipline practically. That is how decades vanish. So I return again to the first principle. Choose the mechanism by which ownership will enter your life. Not in theory and practice, then make the ordinary decisions that support that mechanism. That may mean declining certain lifestyle upgrades. It may mean moving cities. It may mean acquiring a much harder skill. It may mean reading annual reports instead of watching financial television. It may mean saying no to social comparison. It may mean retaining more equity and less comfort during the early years of a company. It may mean doing something deeply unsexy for a very long time. Good. That is the normal shape of wealth. The public sees the visible result and invents a dramatic cause. The truth is usually a very boring cause repeated long enough, and because I know someone listening to this will still be thinking, yes, but what if I choose wrong? Let me say this. The greatest error is usually not choosing the imperfect version of one real path. The greatest error is living in such a way that no path is truly being followed. That is what creates the peculiar pain of middle-aged and talented people. They look around and see that they worked hard, stayed busy, remained respectable, and still somehow do not own enough of anything. The reason is not that life betrayed them. The reason is often that they never built around one of the only mechanisms that create real wealth. They worked, they earned, they reacted, they upgraded, they waited, and time passed. I do not want that for anyone with enough sense to hear this. So here is my blunt closing advice. If you can build something that can scale and keep enough of it. If you cannot or will not build, buy productive assets steadily and let time become your partner. If you lack capital, put yourself where capital pays well. Then convert the income before it turns into costume, build, buy, or enter, and convert. Everything else is a side conversation.